The phrase means communicating with such clarity, fidelity, and mutual understanding that, even when separated by great distance, it feels like a conversation held face to face. It describes a state where intent, nuance, and feeling travel perfectly between people. So geographic separation no longer disrupts the exchange of thought. Story, 1,000 miles. As if beside me. Evelyn learned early that words are not only carriers of facts. They are the architecture of relationships. As a young urban planner, she had spent afternoons sketching parks on a tiny drafting table and evenings learning to listen, not to the loudest voice in public hearings, but to the pauses between sentences, the way a person's shoulder softened when they mentioned a childhood tree, or tensed when talking about a lost market. Those small cues taught her to translate entire lives into plans with integrity. A decade later, her collaborator was Arun, a social economist living 2 time zones east, who spoke in precise metaphors and sent spreadsheets with marginal notes that read like footnotes from a philosopher. They had never worked in the same city. Their first project was a modest stream restoration pilot in a suburb neither had visited. The city hired them because each brought complementary skills: Evelyn's spatial intuition and Arun's ability to map incentives. The brief was simple in words and fiendish in practice: design a public space that residents would steward themselves. They began with video calls, but the real work happened between them. Threaded through messages, annotated PDF, voice notes recorded while walking between meetings. The early days were messy. Evelyn would sketch a concept and Arun would return a table of metrics that assumed different behavioral norms. They argued politely, rigorously, until one evening. After 3 iterations, they stopped quibbling over paragraphs and started over with an exercise Evelyn learned in a community workshop, telling the project's story as if it were a person. Imagine the plaza wakes up, she typed in a late-night message. What does it notice first? Arun replied with a 2-line audio. It feels the footsteps of old habits. Then the small changes act like new rhythms. He broke the sentence with a laugh that made the phrase warmer, less academic. That laugh carried context. He had just walked past a market in his city and pictured the vendor's call. Evelyn read the audio twice and could hear the cadence of his morning. From that moment, their exchange shifted. They started to transmit not only instructions but images, gestures, and tacit assumptions, the kinds of things usually communicated in the margins of coffee shop conversations. Arun began embedding short Arun human vignettes inside his economic models, a week-long snapshot of a family deciding whether to use a community garden. Evelyn annotated her diagrams with emotions. This bench faces morning light, attracts older residents who read the paper. When she described sightlines, she mentioned the smell of jasmine that could drift from a neighbor's balcony at noon. Arun would respond with policy levers that made that jasmine meaningful: microgrants for balcony gardening, bylaws that protected informal markets. Their remote collaboration became a choreography of dense, deliberate signals. They learned to trust small moves, an italicized word, a 2-second pause in a voice note, an arrow on a map. Those tiny cues acted like particles of shared attention. The more they exchanged them, the more their mental models aligned. When Evelyn adjusted a contour line, Arun already knew why. She was accounting for a drain that had been unreliable during spring melt. When Arun suggested a contractual clause, Evelyn felt the implication that a community-run program might need a simple reporting form rather than an audit-heavy obligation. Neighbors in the pilot site noticed the coherence without ever hearing the planner's conversations. Benches gathered people in the sun because they were where rainwater pooled into a shallow garden. A kiosk that doubled as a library became a meeting place because schedules allowed for market vendors to rotate. The plan felt like it had been invented on site, but in truth it had been composed across continents, stitched by hundreds of modest, clarifying gestures. Years later, Evelyn and Arun would speak at the same conference. They met in a crowded lobby and shared a slow, almost private laugh about the first months of friction. For the audience, their rapport seemed instantaneous. For them, it was the accumulated effect of disciplined attunement. They had built methods to carry meaning, stories embedded in spreadsheets, emotional notes alongside timelines, ritualized summaries that closed loops after each week. They had converted distance into a design constraint that, once mastered, made the work more careful, more humane. There is a temptation to romanticize such attunement as magic, as if two minds simply synced. But the truth they taught students later was less mystical and more practical. Fidelity across distance is deliberate. It requires translating assumptions into testable vignettes, surfacing what normally stays implicit, and inventing micro-practices for checking whether you and your collaborator are actually imagining the same thing. It also requires humility, the willingness to reframe a sentence when the other person's silence warns that a phrase landed differently than intended. On a quiet Friday, after their pilot scaled to 3 neighborhoods, Evelyn stood in the plaza she had once only imagined. The jasmine was close enough to touch. A child paddled through a shallow channel of reclaimed water and shrieked with the kind of delight that is languageless and universal. Arun, standing by the kiosk, nudged a vendor into pointing out a particular bench to a newcomer. They watched for a long time, not as creators with a title, but as 2 listeners who finally heard what the place itself was saying. Distance had not vanished. It had been reconfigured into a lattice of practices that let meaning travel. Across that lattice, they had learned to speak and to receive, and in doing so made 1,000 miles feel like the width of a bench between 2 people. Vocabulary, attenuation, the reduction in force, effect, or value of something. In communication, the weakening of a signal or meaning when passed through layers. The memo experienced attenuation as it moved up the bureaucracy, losing the urgency that had been clear in the field report. Attunement, the process of becoming aware of and responsive to another person's feelings or needs. Sensitive alignment of perspectives. Her attunement to the community's daily rhythms made the proposal resonate with residents. Fidelity, the accuracy with which something is reproduced or transmitted. Faithfulness to an original. They insisted on fidelity in the data so policy decisions would reflect lived realities, not assumptions. Nuance, a subtle distinction or variation in meaning. Expression, or tone. The conversation failed until someone acknowledged the nuance in how safety was being used by different stakeholders. Rapport, a relationship characterized by mutual trust, harmony, and understanding. Because she had built a strong rapport with local leaders, meetings moved from confrontation to collaboration. Resonance, the quality of evoking a meaningful or sympathetic response. The amplification of an idea across contexts. The campaign's imagery achieved resonance because it referenced a ritual the community already practiced. Perspicacity, keenness of mental perception and understanding. Acute discernment. His perspicacity allowed him to read between the lines of the budget and foresee implementation bottlenecks. Synchronous, occurring at the same time or in a coordinated manner. Temporally aligned. They scheduled synchronous sessions only when real-time calibration was essential. Tacit, understood or implied without being stated explicitly. Unspoken. Many failures stem from tacit assumptions that were never articulated or tested. Conveyance, the act of communicating or transporting an idea, meaning, or object from one place or person to another. She paid as much attention to the conveyance of the plan as to the plan itself. Knowing format affected uptake. Attestation, evidence or proof that something is true. Or a formal declaration. In collaboration, a check that confirms shared understanding. The weekly attestation email summarized decisions so no one left with divergent expectations. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Cognitive and emotional perspective taking. Empathy guided their interviews. turning questions into invitations rather than interrogations.